Hi, today I'm going to walk you through how to fill out a purchase agreement. So let's get started. Once we're in dot loop, when you go into your loop, you're going to be able to pull up the as is contract and make sure you are only using an as is contract to submit offers and also only accepting offers that are as is. On line one, I will reference throughout this, I'll say on line one, line whatever number, that's a correspondence to over here, okay? So this is a good way because it's a lot of pages, how to reference in a contract. So most importantly, before you get this filled out, you need to open up the property appraiser's address. This is where you're going to pull the legal information to accurately write out the parties' names, okay? So you need to write it exactly how it's written there, verbatim, because that's the legal way it needs to be done. So for the seller, you're going to pull up the address and look how it's written for on the property appraisers and write it under seller. I also recommend you knowing what your buyer's legal's names are. Sometimes it's different than what you thought it was, so that way you put it appropriately there. Also, a note to point out is whoever is going to be on the loan most likely is going to be also the buyer. So make sure you're writing down the correct people. On line 7, that's where we're going to put the street address, city, and zip code. Line 8 is located in what county. Tax ID and legal description both are found on the property appraiser's address. Note to point out here, yes, in theory, can you copy and paste that info from the MLS? Absolutely. However, real estate agents often make mistakes. So if you do copy and paste from there, you are assuming that everything is accurate. So that's why I don't recommend you ever pulling the data from the MLS. Just go right to the property appraisers and fill that out there. So real property on line 9, the legal description that's where that goes there. And we're going to go down to line 21. And if you notice on line 15, we're talking about personal property here that is included, and it actually states out all the personal property. So then on line 21, you can include any other personal property items. A good recommendation to write is verbiage that says, as is, where is, which means is as we saw it is where it's going to be, okay? So that you can include there. And if something is not listed in that paragraph 9, go ahead and include it there. It could be something like an outlier that is not readily observable or a normal thing, so include it there. And then also line 24, there's items that are excluded. So sometimes the listing agent can put in, let's say the private broker notes that the chandeliers do not convey or the security system does not convey. That's where you'd want to then pull that and put it there for them. Let's go down to purchase price and closing. So at line 27 is what we're going to put as the purchase price. Then we're going to go on to line 30 and we are going to say that it accompanies the offer within 3 days. And we're going to put the escrow agent. Traditionally in Palm Beach County, the seller will choose the title company, which you will put as the escrow agent. 99% of the time, they are the same, title company and escrow. Sometimes it's not, but most of the time it is. And then in Broward and Miami, it's more customary for the buyer to choose it, but it's not set by law. So in negotiations, you'll want to be mindful about knowing who is where, but those are also negotiable factors. So you don't have to say that exactly how it is how it is, okay? If there's an additional deposit to be delivered, that can be put on line 37. Sometimes there'll be a first round of escrow deposits and then a second round. When making offers in a very challenging market where there's multiple offer situation, this could be a way to get the deal. In a slower market, you most likely don't have to do an additional deposit, but that's between you and the buyer and how you decide to negotiate your offer. We then have line 39, which is the financing amount, which is the loan amount that they will actually get from the lender. But then also we have a balance to close. So you're going to have to do some math here. And whatever they're putting down as the first deposit, maybe the second deposit, and how much they're having a balance to close, you would put there. This is where I recommend you need to have a really great conversation with your lender as the buyer's agent. You need to know, is your buyer putting 20% down? Are they putting 50% down? What are they putting in escrow? Right? So that's some math you'll have to figure out. I don't want to go too deep in here. I just want to know where you kind of look at and point out for the lines. Line 45 is where you're putting an acceptance time frame. So what this means is this is the time for your buyer to say, hey, we want to negotiate and make it work out, but if we can't, we're walking away. By default, it says 2 days. Most listing agents are not going to negotiate with you longer than 2 days. So if you put a week, they're probably not going to consider that. But it's customary, I would put 1 to 2 days that you want to have an answer. Because if you don't have an answer in 1 to 2 days, you want your buyer to be able to move on if the seller's not playing ball with you, if that makes sense. If we're going to go down, and line 53, before I move to line 53, take note, at the bottom of every page, initials are on each. So your buyer has to initial this, and then we'll send it out to the seller once we fill this out, okay? So back to line 53, this is a closing date. I highly recommend you are in alignment picking this closing date with the lender and the buyer, making sure that you can get it done in this time frame. To give you a thought process, a standard time frame could be 30 days, but sometimes it could be more or quicker depending on the financing involved. I highly recommend you taking time to glance over which each of these things mean. I'm not going to go into great detail now unless it's something I want to point out. I'm only going to point out the things you're supposed to really be filling in and understanding. But I recommend you knowing the contract, because this is what makes you an advisor over just a standard agent that doesn't know how to use this. And you can use it to your advantage when you understand what you can and cannot do. So line 72, you'd only check if it was subject to a lease after occupancy, after closing. Line 7 is called assignability. Now, under most circumstances, they will check, let's see, the third bubble, which is may not assign this contract. That's the best one you want to choose. And that's the one that, on a side note, as a listing agent, you're going to want to choose that. If you check may assign but not be released from liability, that's another probable one. If you ever have a reason to check may assign and be released from liability, we need to have a talk before moving forward. So just put that in the back of your mind. And if you know it says, if no box is checked, then buyer may not assign this contract. So by default, if you don't check anything, by accident, it's they cannot assign this, or move over is what that means. Financing. So if it is a cash transaction, you select line 88. And if it is financing, you select B. And this contract is contingent with, this is where a loan approval period is. So a loan approval is the amount of time a lender has to get a lot of the majority of the loan in progress and to a certain point. Most listing agents will actually want you to put a 15-day time period. Let's say it's a 30-day closing. A lot of times they'll say 15 days. So this is kind of like 15 days to the lender to say that we're going to be able to close this deal. You can leave it blank, which means that it would actually be, by default, it says if left blank, 30 days. But a highly aggressive listing agent might say 15. If that happens, contact the lender. Like you submit your offer with 30 and they come back with 15, make sure to talk to the lender about that. So now you're going to check, are they selecting conventional, FHA, or a VA loan? Is it fixed or adjustable? And that the buyer shall make an application within 5 days. A lot of times agents will leave this blank. By default, it's 5. Again, initials on each page. And this is where closing costs and fees, not all of them, but are mostly broken down. So you can see cost to be paid by buyer. Here's where you get an idea of what the cost might be so that your buyer understands what's going on. If there's additional fees, you can put other here. Title evidence and insurance, if left blank, then 15. Let's go down to line 172. It says seller shall designate closing agent. Option 2 is buyer shall designate closing agent. And then they have a Broward and Miami-Dade provisional. So this is where it is standard for Palm Beach County for the seller to designate, and it is more standard for Miami-Dade and Broward to designate the closing title company. But that is not by law. That is just a standard common way to do stuff. So if you need to switch it up, talk to the broker, talk to me, and let's figure it out. On line 184, this is about a home warranty. If there is not a home warranty, you're just going to select NA. Special assessments. On line 194, it is primarily standard for you to, let's go through the two options. Seller shall pay installments due prior to closing, and buyer shall payment after closing, or seller shall pay in full prior at time of closing. Any assessments allowed by the public body to be prepaid. So as a buyer's agent, I highly recommend you selecting B, because what we're saying is that the seller is paying them in full, and the other option is saying that the seller will pay a certain amount and that the buyer will pay kind of what's ever left. We don't want that option. And if you ever have a situation where, it says right here, if neither box is checked, then option A shall be deemed, okay? So by default, it's kind of giving the looser end option. So my recommendation is that seller shall pay in full at the time of closing, all the stuff. Next is disclosures. These are disclosures to the buyer about radon gas, permit disclosures, mold, flood zone elevation certificate, an energy brochure, lead-based paint, HOA, foreign investment, and seller's disclosure. Sometimes as a buyer's agent, you may be provided a seller's disclosure, and sometimes you may not be provided a seller's disclosure. It just really depends. It is not a mandatory part of the contract. So if you do not receive one, they don't have to provide it. So this is an important part, property inspection with right to cancel. So it has been pretty customary in Palm Beach County at this moment of the recording to do 15 days or less, 5 days, 10 days, and you should base it off the market too. By default, it says 15 days after the effective date. But to be honest with you, if you're doing a 30-day closing and you have 15 days to do the inspection, most listing agents are probably not going to take those terms. So I recommend, even in a slower market or there's not a lot of offers, I would say about 7, 10 at the most, if the listing agent's willing to accept that. And just a point to reference, make sure your buyer understands any and all inspections must be done within this time period, and all negotiations must be done within this time period. You need to advise them on that. So they can do as many as they want. They can do property inspection, mold inspection, water inspection. This is all out of their own pocket. Okay, so it can be $400, it could be $1,000. They can do as many as they want, and the seller has to give them the right to access the property to do this. So make sure they know about that, and we also have to negotiate in that time frame, okay? So once this time period passed, we're all saying we're moving forward in the deal. So if you have 7 days and you accept it, it's from day 1 to day 7, you got to get this done. And you're on the ball and you're getting it, and you have to get it back a report, and you have to be able to negotiate in a timely manner, okay? So time is of the essence throughout this entire contract. I recommend also having go-to recommendations to give your buyers if they don't know an inspector. A point to remember is you cannot mandate or make anyone use anyone you want. I always recommend you say, here's a recommendation, give them 2 or 3 options, but it's their choice at the end of the day who to use. Let's go back down. So walkthrough and re-inspections, a day prior to closing or on the closing date, you go back and check to make sure everything is exactly the way they saw it from weeks ago. So now this starts to talk about escrow agent and broker. This is a lot about the escrow agent, the broker liability, default, dispute resolution, what to do. This is a lot of information that is pre-written, but you can kind of just slowly go over it with your buyer if they want to go further. Now we're going to talk about the title examination, survey, liens. I just made mention to this, but let's read this part. Time is of the essence in this contract. Calendar days, based on where the property is located, shall be used in computing time periods. Other than time for acceptance and effective date, as set forth in paragraph 3, any time periods provided for or dates specified in this contract, whether pre-printed, handwritten, typewritten, or any day on which a national legal public holiday is observed because it fell on a Saturday or a Sunday, shall extend to the next calendar day, which is not a Saturday, Sunday, or public holiday. So you need to understand the time frames of when becomes day 1 to when becomes day 30, which is the closing date. Because if you get off by one date, that could be a negative or a positive, depending on how it works out. So make sure, if you don't understand how this works, to really do a deep dive so you can clearly give yourself the understanding, but the buyers an understanding. Something to take notice is force majeure. Because we live in Florida, there's hurricanes, and I've had this happen before. Go ahead and read this at a later date, but things will get kicked back if there's a natural disaster, and so you need to know about how that works. This is just talking about the closing, prorations and credits that they give to buyers and sellers at any given time, access to property to conduct appraisals and inspections. And so as you can see, there's nothing to fill out here, just a lot of words. And this is an important part. I highly recommend you making sure that you actually check off all the applicable forms that go to it. So if this was an appraisal contingency, if this was housing for older persons, if there's an other, go ahead and add it in. But whatever's checked off here should be attached to the contract. Additional terms. This is where you might need to add in anything else that maybe was not laid out here that you want to explain and go into further detail. And you can see, just so you know, this is on page 13. And if you notice, it says page 13 of 13. So every page says 12 of 13, 11 of 13. So you know if you're missing a page, you know where to fit it in, okay? So every page they're initialing, and then on this last page, they're actually signing, putting their addresses, and we're listing the agents attached. Okay, and this is the only page that doesn't have the initials on the bottom, okay, because they're actually signing. So this is a broad overview of the purchase agreement. I've left out a lot of ways to negotiate and how to write really fantastic offers, but this is the groundwork for how to do that. So I hope you do well in writing your offer, and good luck.